Coming up, two Appalachian mysteries that have baffled scientists and historians to this very day. This is Appalachia After Dark. Our first story takes place in Jonesville, Virginia, where the extraordinary events that began occurring nightly with Bertha soon captured the nation's attention and even brought researchers from around the world who still couldn't solve this baffling mystery.
In many ways, the Seibert family were your typical mountain folks. After all, their great-grandparents were among the first original white pioneers to settle the Jonesville, Virginia area, situated along the Daniel Boone Wilderness Trail in the late 1700s. The couple built their picturesque cabin high atop Powell Mountain in the upper end of Wallens Creek and began raising corn on the rocky soil. The steep climb to the homestead was enough to make the most rugged mountain man double over from exhaustion on his way to the top. However, the view from the mountain summit was spectacular, and on a clear day, you could see the mighty blue waters of the Powell River shimmering below in the distance. Yet, the Seibert family weren't the only family to call this place home. They soon discovered an old lady that lived on the opposite side of the mountain that most folks called Granny Moses. At first, they seemed to coexist together just fine, but the Seiberts began to notice that year after year, for some strange reason, the old woman never grew any crops. Heck, she didn't keep any chickens or livestock either. She was rarely even seen, except a few times in the shadows, picking wild herbs from the forest. With the Seiberts family growing, they decided they'd begin farming on Granny Moses' side of the mountain, and the crop turned out to be one of the biggest crops they had ever produced on this mountain. And one morning, as several of the Seibert family members were loading corn onto a sled tied behind their mule, Granny Moses appeared from the mist of the cornfield. This was literally the first time they'd ever seen the woman face to face. Grandpap Seibert called out,
"Howdy, ma'am. How goes it?"
The old woman replied with dead silence, as her eyes shifted slowly from each member of the Seibert family, with a glare so deep it seemed to peer into each person's soul.
"Mighty kind of you to let us raise a crop this year on your side of the hill. As you can see, it's a powerful big crop of corn. And don't you worry, we aim to fill your corn crib plumb to the top as a thank you."
Granny Moses slowly turned to the sled, full of corn. She picked up an ear in her hands, and she examined it. Suddenly, she broke the thick silence with these words, "If you eat a single bite of this corn, your family will forever be cursed, and you will have given life to the darkness that has laid dormant in his soul, just waiting for fools such as you to come along. I've seen it with my own eyes once before, and I know this ground is cursed. Do not eat it. You have been warned." And with that, the old lady slowly turned and disappeared into the morning fog, into the thickness of the corn patch. And as it turns out, this would be the last time they would ever see her again. But as fate would have it, her words would live on much longer than any of the Seibert family could have ever imagined. And so it was. For nearly 150 years, each successive generation of the Seibert family called this place home. And while the population down in the mountain valley grew, there remained but just a few of the hardiest families, living high among the steep ridges. This was the world that Bertha Seibert was born into during the fall of 1929. Just like all her family that came before her, she was born in that old 3-room cabin that her great-grandparents had built. Bertha was a curious little girl with golden blonde hair, blue eyes, and pink cheeks. She was the oldest of 4 siblings and a hard worker. Like all mountain children, she spent most of her time helping out on the family farm. Bertha loved visiting all of her relatives who lived on Powell Mountain, especially her grandma and her grandpa, who still lived in the ancestral cabin. It seemed like every time she'd visit her papa, he would have a new corncob doll made for her. She'd sit on the porch and play with her doll as the old man told stories that happened long ago on the mountain. Bertha liked it when he told her spooky stories, and she would always beg him to tell another. And by the time she went home, she'd be so scared she'd run down that mountain so fast that all you could see was a trail of dust flying from her bare feet. By the year 1939, Bertha was 9 years old and in the 2nd grade. Each day she led her younger siblings down the mountain to the one-room schoolhouse in the valley. All of the kids loved going to school, since it was the only time they ever had a chance to see any other kids that weren't their kinfolk. Bertha was one of the most popular girls and was deemed to be a good speller by her teacher. It seemed that the young girl was living a simple, good life surrounded by her family and friends. Early one morning, Bertha awoke to a loud commotion, and as the young girl peeked down the ladder that led from the bedroom loft, she heard her pa say that Grandpa had taken ill and was powerful sick. They didn't even know if he'd make it through the day. Within minutes, Bertha, her ma and pa, and all her siblings made the steep climb up to the old man's cabin, and they held a vigil for the next 48 hours, sitting with him beside his bed as he slowly got weaker and weaker. Everybody took turns sitting at his bed nonstop. On the second night, as young Bertha held onto her grandpa's hand, he opened up his eyes for the first time in over a day. The weak old man slowly turned his head and smiled at his granddaughter. "Come closer, my sweet child. I have one last story for you," he began. "When I was a little boy, about your age, my great-grandfather told me a story that had been passed down to him by his great-grandfather. A story that he had never shared with anyone before until he passed it down to me. Now, I must warn you, I've never told this story to anyone since my grandpap told me. And I swore to him I would keep it a secret, but I can't let it die with me." "I'm listening, Papa," the young girl said. "Long, long ago, something evil happened on this mountain. Long before the white man ever arrived here, the natives, they knew about it, and they believed this mountain was cursed. For many years, no one dared to live on this mountain, except an old mountain witch. No one knows for sure how she did it. But somehow, the witch survived on this mountain without ever eating anything that grew here. She was only seen in the shadows until one day our ancestors settled on this mountain. The legends passed down by my great-grandpap say that many of our families suffered strange visitations, things that couldn't be explained. Some say that folks were possessed by dark forces." "Now, Grandpa, you know that ain't true," the girl interrupted. The old man smiled, and with what little strength he had left, he let out a weak, faint laugh. "Oh, my child, you'll see. You'll see." And with that, the old man died. After her grandpa died, Bertha moved into the old cabin with her grandma to help out. There was only one bedroom in the cabin, and the young mountain child shared the bed with her grandmother. By fall, the family began bringing the corn harvest in for the year, when Bertha began to have strange visions. Each night as she slept, she kept seeing an old woman's face. The old woman was smiling and would reach out her hand for the child, when Bertha would suddenly wake up from the bed, startling her grandmother, who was sleeping beside her.
"Gal, what's gotten into you?"
the old woman asked.
"I'm seeing things that ain't there, Grandma. Some lady's reaching for me when I sleep,"
Bertha replied.
"Young'un, there ain't no haints in here, and I got a Bible laying on the table right next to you. There ain't nothing to be afeared of."
"Yes, Grandma," the child answered as she glanced over towards the old Bible, taking a bit of assurance that possibly it might protect her from her dreams. The next night, Bertha lied awake as her grandmother slept beside her. A strange sensation fell upon her. She had an eerie feeling that something was in the room. Her heart was racing and her palms began to sweat as she gripped the old homemade quilt tightly. Suddenly, the cabin floor began creaking, as if something was walking towards her. The frightened child pulled the covers over her head as the creaking grew closer and closer. Out of nowhere, the sound stopped. What was it? Was it gone? Slowly, she began to pull the covers down and try to peek out, when out of nowhere, something ripped the sheets off the bed. Bertha screamed at the top of her lungs. And there it was, an old lady hovered above the bed, and she breathed something into the young girl's face. Both the grandmother and the child flew from the bed.
What was that? What's wrong with you?
The old lady yelled.
Grandma, did you see it? Did you see it? It was right above me. Gal, what in tarnation put such foolishness in your mind? All I saw was you pull the sheets right off of me and wake me up. Now I'm warning you. I'm going to put you on the floor if you don't stop this foolishness. You hear me?
The traditions of the mountains demanded that the young girl obey her grandmother and not question her judgment. So Bertha yielded without protest. Terrified, she remained eyes open wide until the sun rose the next morning. The next night, Bertha was completely exhausted. Oh, she hadn't slept in days. She laid down early that night, and the old mountain woman watched as her grandchild fell fast asleep. And then she slipped into the kitchen to finish cleaning up the supper dishes. After a while, she went outside to make sure the smokehouse door was shut good to keep the animals out. The signs of the moon and the clouds in the sky forebode that the coming winter was shaping up to be one of the harshest in years. Last thing they needed was to lose the meat from last week's hog killing. It was all they'd have to make it through the winter. As she approached the smokehouse, she heard something on the wind, some animal-type sound. She stopped for a moment and listened. There it was again, some gnawing sound. What was it? It was hard to tell where it was coming from. It grew louder. The sound of gnawing and scratching, and a striking metal sound. She turned and looked back towards the cabin, when suddenly Bertha screamed. Frantically, the old woman picked up an axe that was leaning against the smokehouse, and she moved as quickly as her old bones would let her.
Hold on, youngin'. I'm coming. Hold on.
The sounds grew louder as she approached the porch. As she threw the front door open, she felt the entire cabin floor violently shaken, and a thundering sound coming from the bedroom. Bertha's screams were combined with an animalistic fury. As Granny made it to the bedroom, the door wasn't locked, but something was holding it shut, pulling back as the old woman struggled to open the door. Pictures were swaying back and forth on the living room walls. A gust of wind poured into the room, so strong it blew out the flames in the fireplace. Granny picked up the axe and she began swinging at the bedroom door. Over and over until the door split open. And as she peered into the bedroom, she couldn't believe her eyes. The entire 200-pound oak bed was bouncing completely off the floor as the 60-pound girl was tossed back and forth, screaming for her life. Granny looked up at the headboard, and there she saw two hands that weren't human, firmly gripped on the bedpost, violently shaking the bed. The young girl was thrown completely off the bed, where she hit her head on the bedside table and was rendered unconscious, with the Bible falling from the table beside the little girl. And in that instant, a thunderous evil scream came from the bed, so loud that it echoed through the hollers surrounding the homestead. All at once, the room went completely black and silent. Granny dropped her axe and fell to her knees. My God, what was that? By the next day, wagon tongues had spread the story all over Powell Mountain and down into Jonesville. You see, superstitions, the belief in the unexplained, and supernatural events ran strong in the mountain folk. Bertha's father relayed the event to the Baptist preacher in great detail, and within hours, the preacher and two deacons from the church made the steep climb up the mountain to the rustic cabin, where they found the young girl sitting in a split-bottom chair in the kitchen, smiling as if nothing had happened. The preacher immediately said that he felt an evil presence in the room, and he took out a cross from around his neck and attempted to place it on the young girl's forehead, when out of nowhere, the chair flew backwards nearly 4 feet across the room, and a cold chill suddenly filled the air. Bertha calmly looked on and smiled at the men.
"My God, Brother John, did you see that?"
The terrified father said as his voice was shaken.
"I'm afraid it's worse than I feared,"
the preacher replied as he slowly walked backwards away from the smiling child.
"It's going to take all of God's children to stand up and drive this demon out."
And with that, the elders of the church left to gather up the entire church body. Their plan was to return at sunset, each person armed with the Bible and the Word of God. Surely this would drive the spirit out of Bertha. That afternoon, there were nearly a score of horses and several wagons at the bottom of the mountain, and nearly 60 people climbed to the top to confront the darkness that had taken over the 9-year-old girl. Most folks still had doubts as to if the rumors were really true. Did the bed really bounce off the floor? Was there really poltergeist activity in that cabin? So far, the grandmother was the only one who had witnessed the majority of the paranormal activity. Maybe the chair had simply slipped across the kitchen. Folks just didn't know what to expect. Once they reached the top of the mountain, one by one, they entered the 3-room cabin, led by the preacher. The grandmother met them at the door.
"She's in the bed. She's sleeping and everything seems okay. Can't we just let her be?" "I'm afeard not," the preacher replied. "We can't allow the darkness to dwell inside this child for another minute."
And with that, the entire church body began singing hymns, filling the small bedroom until the crowd spilled over into the living room and on the porch looking through the window. Slowly, Bertha opened her eyes, and the preacher began.
"In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost, we rebuke you, Satan. We command you to flee from the child and vacate this home."
The faithful continued singing, many thrusting their Bibles towards a small child, whose father was standing next to her, encouraging her.
"Fight with everything you have, Bertha."
Yet, everyone in the room could feel the sudden temperature change and heard the gnawing sounds coming from the bed. And slowly, the mattress started moving. Up and down, the gnawing and clashing, grinding sounds of the metal box springs filled the room. Bertha's head turned towards her father, and she began speaking in some tongue that no one could understand.
"Fight, Bertha! Fight it, gal!"
her father replied. But by now, the entire bed was bouncing off the floor when 4 stout miners grabbed a hold of each bedpost and attempted to hold it down to the ground. Each man weighed nearly 200 pounds, yet they couldn't stop the bouncing bed. Stunned and terrified, the crowd began pressing backwards, and folks began to fight their way out the front door of the cabin. No one had ever seen anything like this. Everyone who was in attendance was convinced that what they witnessed was not of this world. By the next day, the sheriff had an emergency meeting with the county commissioners. Indeed, everyone in the town was talking about the mountain girl that folks were now referring to as Bouncing Bertha. The sensational story began to travel across state lines, and it caught the attention of 2 professors from the University of Tennessee who decided to make the pilgrimage to Bertha's cabin and study the phenomenon for themselves. The night the professors arrived, the grandmother made them supper, and as they were eating dinner, out of nowhere, all the meat flew off their plates and flew across the room, and their bowls of soup all turned over. Later, just like every night before, Bertha's bed continued to bounce uncontrollably. Having seen enough, the professors promptly hurried out of the cabin. However, being men of education and firm believers in science, all they would comment at the time was that the events were peculiar, and they were reported to have said they needed to hurry back to Tennessee to examine the evidence. That event sparked national interest, and soon the story of Bouncing Bertha was front page news and the talk of every radio station all across America.
Once 2 college doctors came from Tennessee to visit Bertha's family, writing down all they had seen. While they ate their dinner, the meat flew from their plates. The soup tureen turned over, and they noted that was strange. As she cried when she tried to sleep, that's when that white fuzzy spirit started to creep. There she lay when people came to watch that child's bed hop bouncing. Bertha was her name.
For 19 straight nights, the paranormal activity that possessed young Bertha continued. Her father decided to get the girl away from the cabin in an attempt to solve the riddle. He had her spend the night at a cousin's house nearly 2 miles away. Yet, the bed continued to bounce. Bertha's grandmother would tell anyone who would listen that this was the work of a mountain witch. They tried everything. They put a silver coin under her pillow. They shot her picture with a silver bullet. Yet, the phenomenon continued. The only thing that seemed to slow down the spirit was when a Bible was placed under Bertha's head. All told, young Bertha was visited by some unknown spirit for 35 straight nights. The story captivated the nation, and everybody had an opinion. Folks traveled from all over America to Bertha's small cabin to witness the event. At the time, the most famous magician in the world was Houdini, and his wife was set to make the journey there in an attempt to prove that the events weren't real. In one of the more curious events, the two University of Tennessee professors that were in such a hurry to get out of that cabin as fast as they could so that they could, quote-unquote, examine the evidence, suddenly signed an agreement with a prominent scientific journal where they were paid to write an article stating that the entire events were fake. Their copyrighted results were then sold to newspapers all across America. That was enough to convince most folks across America that the events suddenly weren't real. But for the mountain folks who witnessed it, no, they knew better. There's some things in these mountains that science will never be able to explain, let alone two book-educated college professors that were paid to publish their findings. Bertha finally moved away from her grandmother's, and she lived with another family member to escape the non-stop press. Still, folks continued to flock to the cabin, where her grandmother swore to her dying day to anybody that would listen that what she saw was not of this world and was flat-out witchery. Bertha herself never publicly commented on these events for the rest of her life. It seems she didn't want to breathe life into whatever it was again. How about you? Do you think it was real or a hoax? Did the mountain witch curse that family? Was it a Native American curse? Let me know in the comments below.
Don't go anywhere, folks. There's plenty more coming up, and you don't want to miss the next story.
Give someone you love the gift of old-fashioned storytelling. 4 books for the young and old alike that will make your heart smile. Click the link below to order your copy of the Appalachian Storyteller today.
Our next story takes us to West Virginia for the astonishing true story of the only documented case in the history of American judicial court system where a ghost actually testified in court and led the jury to convict a man of murder.
During the 1890s, superstition and the existence of ghosts was widely accepted as a natural fact in the Appalachian Mountains. After all, it was during this time that the Ouija board first began selling all across America, and nearly everyone was under the alluring spell of spiritualism. Now, whether or not you believe in ghosts, it's a fact that in 1897, a ghost entered the official law books in West Virginia. That's right, and it's the only known case in history where the testimony of a ghost led to the conviction of a murderer. Now, I know what you're thinking. Oh, heck, there ain't no way that's a bunch of hogwash. Well, my friend, prepare yourself for the remarkable true story of the Greenbrier Ghost. Our story begins in the fall of 1896 in Greenbrier County, West Virginia. All of the ladies in this small community were abuzz with curiosity due to a tall young man who had just rolled into town. Local gossip was that Edward Shue had come to Greenbrier to work at a local blacksmith shop. Now, Edward was a towering, handsome man with ocean blue, deep-set eyes and a chiseled jaw, with thick, lush brown hair and broad shoulders. He was extremely strong, muscular, and flashed a quick smile that made him a natural ladies' man. It wasn't long before he caught the attention of a beautiful 20-year-old woman named Zona Hester. She was free-spirited and untamed, with a willowy face, long silk-like hair, and molasses brown eyes. Both Edward and Zona were instantly attracted to each other, and a whirlwind courtship soon followed Now, many folks warned Zona not to move too fast with Edward. Besides, just where did this fella come from? And who knew what his mysterious and unknown past might be hiding? Yet, Zona had a rebellious spirit. Heck, she already had a child out of wedlock 2 years earlier when she was 18. So, despite concerns from her mother and others, Zona and Edward were married in November of 1896, within just a couple months of meeting each other at the old Methodist church at Livesay's Mill. The young couple seemed to be living a happy life together. They settled into a small 2-story home just on the other side of Sewell Mountain from Zona's childhood home, 14 miles away, where her mother still lived. Edward spent his days working hard, forging horseshoes in front of the open fire at the local blacksmith shop. Zona spent her days tending to household chores and cooking meals for her husband. The Christmas of 1896 came and went, and by all appearances, they were happy, and they had a long future in front of them. However, not all things are always as they seem from the outside, and there were long, cold winter months that laid ahead. It's only so long that a man can keep a secret past hidden in these mountains. Just who had Zona married, and what was he really hiding behind those dark eyes? By January 1897, Zona and Edward Shue had been married for just over 3 months when Zona suddenly took sick. For several weeks, she was under the care of Dr. J.M. Knapp, who visited her house regularly to check on her. Edward appeared to be very attentive to his young bride's needs. He even hired an 11-year-old boy named Andy Jones to drop by the house each day and help out with the housework and tend to their animals. On the morning of January 22nd, Edward stopped at Andy's cabin on the way to his blacksmith shop, and he asked the boy if he would go and attend to some chores for Zona. However, Andy had already committed to go to work for a local doctor that day. Edward seemed a little irritated by this. As the morning went on, there were 4 separate times that Edward went back to Andy's house and kept asking him to go check on Zona before the young boy finally agreed. Now, what I'm about to tell you is word for word what Andy said happened when he got to Zona's house, the same way he told this story 70 years later in his life. When I got to the house, I felt that something was wrong. All the doors were closed, and there was an air about the place that I just didn't like. When I got to the steps, I looked down and I saw a trail of blood, and it scared me. But I got the courage up and I went to the door and I knocked. No one answered. There was nothing but silence. I tried the doorknob and it was unlocked. So I slowly opened the door and I walked into the kitchen. The trail of blood continued across the kitchen floor, all the way to the dining room door, which was also closed. Once again, I knocked on the door. "Miss Shue, are you in there?" But nobody answered. So I opened the door and I walked in, and as soon as I did, I stumbled over something. When I hit the ground, I realized I was on top of Miss Shue's body. There she was, stretched out on the floor, looking right up at me through wide open eyes. Her face was frozen in time, and she appeared to be laughing. I was scared to death, but I was still able to reach down and shake her. And when I touched her, she was cold and stiff. I bolted out of that house running as fast as I could. I called across the field to Aunt Martha. "Miss Sue is dead! Miss Sue is dead!" Aunt Martha started running to the house to check on Miss Sue, while I ran to the blacksmith shop to tell Mr. Sue. When I told him what I found, he yelled, and with his boss, they both started for the house while I ran on to get Dr. Knapp. By the time the doctor and I arrived back to the house, Mr. Sue had taken his wife from the floor, placed her on a bed, and he was holding her head in his arms, crying for her to come back. But the strangest thing of all, although nobody thought about it at the time, was that he had already dressed Miss Sue in a long gown for her funeral, placing one of those old-fashioned, high, stiff collars around her neck and holding it in place with some kind of scarf. Dr. Knapp immediately started investigating to determine if Miss Sue was still alive, and throughout his efforts to revive the woman, Mr. Sue continued to hold her head, refusing to let the doctor examine it. Oh, but the doctor felt awful for Edward, and he could see that this man had just lost his entire life as he held Zona in his arms. Finally, the doctor turned and said, "It's everlasting faint. Her heart has failed."
I've been on this gospel way for many, many days, but I know it won't be long till I am gone.
The very next morning, Zona's body, accompanied by her husband and several neighbors, was taken back over the mountain to her mother's home. And within 24 hours, she was buried in the little family graveyard high up on the side of the mountain. Indeed, Edward was devastated by the loss of Zona. The entire time leading up to the funeral, he never once left his dead wife's side in the presence of others. Before they put Zona's body in a coffin, he wouldn't let anyone else go near her, not even her mother. He stood the entire time near Zona's head, crying and sobbing and moaning and wailing. To make Zona more comfortable, he said, he folded a sheet on both sides of her head. Now, folks began talking about Edward's grief. Many folks admired the love and the tender care that he showed his wife after her death. Others weren't so convinced. After all, it was the custom during those days for women to care for the body of a deceased wife, to wash it and dress it for the funeral. Why had Edward done these things himself? Was this everlasting love, or something more sinister? Zona's death hit her mother hard. They were literally best friends. Her daughter had only been married for just a few months, and now she was dead. Heck, her mother had never even had a chance to visit Edward in Zona's home. Everything was so sudden, and there were no answers. However, this wasn't the end of the story, and what happens next is still talked about 130 years later. In the weeks after Zona's funeral, her mother, Mary Hester, couldn't seem to get over the death of her daughter. She leaned heavily on her faith in the Lord, and she prayed daily to Him to reveal the cause of Zona's death. About a month later, Mary was kneeling next to her bed, praying for answers, when she felt a strange presence enter the room. Now, she wasn't sleeping or dreaming. She was wide awake. She looked up, and she saw an aura in the doorway that began to take the shape of a human. Mary's heart was racing, and chills ran down her spine as the spirit transformed into Zona right before her eyes. Mary was speechless, and she reached out to fill Zona's coffin, but she wasn't in a coffin anymore. Zona reached her hand towards her mother, and she opened her mouth to say something, but then she suddenly vanished. The very next day, Mary remained in constant, non-stop prayer when suddenly Zona appeared before her again. This time, she told her mother all about the home that her and Edward lived in. She disclosed small details about the cellar, the closets, the attic. All sorts of details that only someone who lived there would know. Now Mary, she had never even visited the home. Yet now, she knew every detail about the home Zona was living in. Zona told her mother to rest, and she would return the next day. Sure enough, on the third day, Zona appeared again to her mother. However, she didn't want to discuss the home anymore. This time she talked about her husband, Edward. She told her mother that he was a very violent man, and he had abused her many times. She warned her mother that Edward had been married twice before, and he had beat both of his previous wives. His second wife had mysteriously died, just like Zona. Mary begged Zona to tell her what happened to her. "Not yet, Mother," she said. "I will return tomorrow. I have something to show you." On the fourth day, Zona appeared to Mary for a final time. Zona began sharing exactly what happened the day she died. Mama, I spent all morning cleaning the house and cooking all afternoon for Edward. But this time when he came home, he was angry again, like many nights before. He began yelling at me that I hadn't cooked any meat for supper. I told him that I cooked everything we had, and there was plenty. We had bread and butter, applesauce, preserves, and other things that make up a fine, good supper. After I was finished speaking, he flew into a rage and he got up and he came towards me. When I raised up, he seized each side of my head with his hands, and with a sudden wrench, he broke my neck and dragged my body to the foot of the stairs and left me there. Now, Mama, I have something to show you, Zona said. And with that, Zona spun her entire head around 180 degrees, like a scene out of The Exorcist, to prove that her neck was broken. She disappeared and never returned again. Mary now knew that Edward had murdered Zona, just like he had murdered his first wife, and she couldn't let him get away with it. She spent the next several days telling anyone who would listen to her what Zona had told her. At first, most folks just thought she was a grieving mother and just acting out in sorrow. However, some folks believed her enough to arrange a meeting between Mary and the Greenbrier County prosecuting office. Mary spent the entire day telling the prosecutor what Zona had told her, and they summoned the doctor who had examined Zona and determined her cause of death. The doctor admitted that he hadn't really fully examined Zona because he felt sorry for her grieving husband as he held her body. Armed with this new circumstantial evidence, the prosecutor summoned Edward and the doctor, and they decided to do something unthinkable. That's right. They headed to the graveyard to dig up Zona's body. But what would they find? The next morning, the three men walked into the foggy graveyard, armed with shovels, and began digging until they reached Zona's coffin. They loaded her casket on the back of a wagon, and they took it to a nearby one-room schoolhouse, where they opened the coffin up, and they began the gruesome task of examining the body. The prosecutor forced Edward to stay in the room with Zona's body as the doctor examined it for the next 3 days. For the most part, Edward sat in a corner, whittling on sticks with his pocket knife, as the doctor performed the examination. However, once the doctors began removing the collar from Zona's neck, Edward became noticeably anxious. There was bruising on her neck, consistent with fingers being wrapped around her neck. Her windpipe was crushed, and it was obvious that the first and second vertebrae in her neck were broken in the exact place that Zona's ghost said it was. Edward was immediately placed under arrest and charged with the murder of Zona.
Thanks so much for watching, folks. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button, and we'll see you on the next episode of the Appalachian Storyteller.